So tonight's presentation is from Rudy, and as he gives two this year? Just one. Oh my goodness. It's many. But anyway, it's the title is Meredith at the Battle of Bunker Hill. Rudy is the former editor of the Meredith News and the author of many of the books that are back there on the table, and more to come. So with that, I welcome Rudy.
Thank you. Make sure this thing is working here. Okay. Before I get started, I just wanted to tell a little story. I don't know if any of you remember Heidi Edgar. She passed away a few years ago. And we used to work together at the Meredith News there for a while. And I had always wanted to get a picture of a moose. And one day she called back to me. She said, "Oh, a moose just ran down Water Street." So I grabbed my camera real quick and went running down Water Street. Didn't see a thing. Came running back, crossed over the canal, ran down High Street. I didn't see a thing. I came back huffing and puffing and said, "I didn't find him anywhere." And she looked up at me and she says, "April Fools." So it's appropriate for that for today anyway. Okay, so how many here know what the term semi-quincentennial means?
It's the 250th anniversary.
Well, it actually means half of a 500-year anniversary. Semi-quincentennial. But that's what they're calling this. And we begin to celebrate, we begin to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution and our nation's independence this year, which started actually with the battles of Lexington and Concord in April 18th, 250 years ago. I was going to give this program actually in June, but I ended up having to switch dates with another presenter. So I figured, well, I can tie it into the battles of Lexington and Concord. It works just as well. So anyway, 250 years ago this month, American patriots and British soldiers engaged in skirmishes at Lexington and Concord, setting in motion the eventual independence of the United States as a separate sovereign nation. 2 months later, on June 17, 1775, Americans demonstrated their resolve in a major battle fought primarily on Breed's Hill in Charlestown, Mass. It has somewhat mistakenly come to be known as the Battle of Bunker Hill. Actually, part of it did take place on Bunker Hill, but we'll get into that. Before we talk about that battle, though, we need to get our brains into the right mindset. For Americans, it was a mindset that evolved over the previous decade, with colonists growing increasingly frustrated over what they perceived to be mistreatment on the parts of King George III and the British Parliament. So it all started with taxes and a standing army. Now, traditionally, the English kings had let colonial governors and militias defend their separate colonies on their own with little military assistance from England. But that changed with the last French and Indian War in the 1750s and 60s. To defend his American colonies against the French and their Native American allies, George II had shipped over an army of British redcoats. And when George II died in 1760, near the end of the war, his 22-year-old grandson, George III, succeeded him. And following the war, the new King George decided to maintain a standing British army in the colonies and to impose new taxes on the colonists to pay for it. And it didn't take long for colonists to object with a rallying cry, "Taxation without representation." So anti-British sentiment became further inflamed locally, right here in Meredith, during the early settlement of our town. When residents petitioned the state for incorporation in 1768, New Hampshire's young new governor, John Wentworth, took it upon himself to rename it, and instead of the township's preferred name of New Salem, he replaced it with one of his own, naming it Meredith after his English friend, Sir William Meredith. Now, perhaps if the local settlers had realized that Sir Meredith was doing his best over in Parliament to do away with the new taxes, they would have felt differently. But they had no idea who he was. And it galled them to have their town name usurped, and it stoked an increasing dissatisfaction with anything English. Well, anti-British settlement continued to fester across the colonies as members of new groups such as the Sons of Liberty and influencers like Sam Adams in Massachusetts and Patrick Henry in Virginia fanned the flames. As Parliament continued its attempts to impose new taxes, various demonstrations of opposition erupted, such as the 1765 Stamp Act riot in Portsmouth, the 1772 Pine Tree riot in Ware, New Hampshire, and the 1773 Boston Tea Party. England attempted to institute martial law down in Boston under General Thomas Gage, and he made 2 attempts to round up guns, powder, and ammunition from colonial stockpiles, and it failed both times. The first one had Paul Revere riding from Boston to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, on December 13, 1774, to warn residents there that General Gage was sending ships to remove supplies from Fort William and Mary, located in Portsmouth Harbor. Well, some 400 patriots responded before the ships arrived by raiding the fort and confiscating the gunpowder that was there. And of course, again, it was Paul Revere and others who rode out on the 18th of April in 75 to warn that the British were marching west from Boston in order to confiscate armaments stockpiled in Concord, Mass. By the time British troops arrived in Lexington and Concord the next morning, local militia units had gathered to stop them, and the revolution began with a so-called shot heard round the world. Now, by this time, Governor Wentworth had already lost control of the New Hampshire province's elected legislature down in Portsmouth, and members had begun holding their own rogue legislature up in over in Exeter. Once the so-called Third Provincial Congress had learned of the battles of Lexington and Concord, they hurriedly reconvened, and on April 26, which was just 1 week after the battles, they voted, quote, that it be recommended to the several towns, parishes, and places in their province to engage as many men in each town as they think it fit and proper, to properly equipped and ready to march at a minute's warning on any emergency. So they also resolved to expand their membership and to call a 4th Provincial Congress. And when Meredith received its precepts, which was the official name for the instructions to hold an election, they voted to elect Ebenezer Smith as their deputy to attend the 4th Provincial Congress down in Exeter. And they voted on this at a meeting on May 15th of 1775. Now, voters at that meeting also voted to authorize in the warrant for that meeting. They voted to they wanted to authorize 14 local men to respond down to Lexington and Concord to help the Americans fight against the British. When they held the meeting, though, they held the meeting on the 15th. All they could afford was for 10 soldiers, but already 13 had responded. Now, as I tracked through individual service records, I have found these 13 who joined the cause. 5 of them marched with the popular Colonel John Stark, and they were John Kimball, Oliver Smith Jr., Benjamin Neely, Thomas Frohawk, and George Bean. They soon found themselves encamped with the rest of Stark's regiment on Winter Hill, 3 miles northeast of Cambridge, Massachusetts. Well, another 8 local residents also answered the call, but ended up in the ranks of Colonel Enoch Poor's New Hampshire Regiment. And they were John Robinson, Aaron Rollins, Jacob Eaton, Benjamin Eaton, Thomas Dockham, Daniel Ward, Jonathan Smith, and his brother Pearson Smith. Poor's regiment was stationed to help defend the Portsmouth Harbor and didn't join the Army in Massachusetts until after the Battle of Bunker Hill. Well, Colonel John Stark, later a general, plays such a significant role in New Hampshire's history that I'll devote a little time to reviewing his early resume. He was a native of Londonderry and grew up in Derryfield, which is now Manchester. And in his young 20s, he was captured by a party of Abenaki warriors during a fur trapping expedition on the Baker River. He was brought to the natives' village on the St. Francis River up in Canada, and when he was forced to run the gauntlet, he turned the tables on one of his attackers by grabbing his stick and turning it around and using it on them. So that won the admiration of the village chief, who took Stark into his own household. Well, he was held there for about a year until he was ransomed and returned home in 1753. 2 years later, in the winter of 1755, at the beginning of the French and Indian War, Stark joined the ranks of Rogers Rangers as a lieutenant. He participated in the 1759 capture of the French Fort Carillon, which was later renamed Fort Ticonderoga, over on Lake Champlain. Later that year, the British planned to build a road over the Green Mountains to connect Lake Champlain with Fort Number 4, which was in Charlestown, Charlestown, New Hampshire. He chose John Stark to lead that crew to build the so-called Crown Point Road. Well, his earlier exploits had gained Stark a popular reputation, and when he received word of the engagement at Lexington and Concord, he sprang into action. As accounted in one biography, quote, he stopped his mill and went to his house, took his musket and $3 in his pocket, and without any coat that he might not be encumbered, he went off to meet his little band, presumably meaning his local militia unit. Well, according to another biography, quote, on the march south, the little band, following Stark, grew until 1,000 volunteers arrived at Cambridge. Other sources put the number at 800, but either way, it was pretty impressive. Now, near the end of... Oh, whoops.
Shot around the world.
Oh, goodness. I can't speak any longer. All right. So his group ended up being either 8,000 or 800 or 1,000. So near the end of the month of April, the entourage chose Stark as their regimental colonel. The New Hampshire legislature, now including Meredith Ebenezer Smith, further cemented that choice on May 22nd, commissioning Stark as colonel of the 1st New Hampshire Regiment, with Enoch Poor commanding the 2nd New Hampshire and James Reed the 3rd. Got up here. There we go. So the appointment of Stark noted that his regiment was encamped now at Medford. This was at Winter Hill in Cambridge, now part of Somerville, Massachusetts. That name might sound familiar to you because 2 centuries later, it was the namesake of Whitey Bulger's Winter Hill Gang. Well, Winter Hill was one of the encampments encircling the Boston Peninsula, which combined became known as the Siege of Boston. This blocked overland supply routes from area farms. The British and the remaining residents in the city had to rely on the British Navy and the Merchant Marine to bring in supplies by ship. And it wasn't only the humans that needed supplies. The British also had to feed their horses and livestock. And there was only minimal pasturage that was available on Boston Common. As a result, they used a couple of islands in Boston Harbor. And one of them was called Noddle's Island and the other Hog Island. And there they would pasture their livestock and also harvest the salt hay for fodder. So here you can see Noddles Island and Hog Island. And now this little stream around is called Chelsea Creek. This has all been filled in now, and this is now the location of East Boston and Logan Airports. So Patriot General Artemus Ward from Massachusetts recognized this as a British vulnerability, one that the Americans could exploit. So he sent orders to Colonel Stark on May 26 to lead the effort. And Stark gathered a detachment of at least 300 of the regiment. One source claims it was about 600. And they set out about 10 a.m. the next morning. They waded across the shallow creek and as quietly and unobtrusively as possible led all of the livestock off the islands. And after all the critters were removed, then they lit the standing hay. Too late, the British saw the smoke and realized what was happening. They sent one of their ships, the Diana, up Chelsea Creek to engage the Americans, but it was just a bad day for the British. The tide was low and they went to ground. Another ship had to rescue the hapless Englishmen, and afterwards the Americans proceeded to strip everything possible off of the Diana, including their cannons, and they torched what was left. Soldiers from 4 independent provinces were now amassed around Boston, and as they settled in, the matter of military hierarchy came up. Stark's regiment had initially settled in under the command of Massachusetts General Artemus Ward, but the fledgling New Hampshire legislature quickly sought to keep troops from their own province under their own control. They formalized Stark's commission as commander of the 1st New Hampshire Regiment, but he would now answer to New Hampshire General Nathaniel Folsom, who in turn would coordinate with General Ward. So General Folsom's New Hampshire Brigade also included 2 other regiments. As mentioned earlier, they were the 7 recruits from Meredith who were in Enoch Poor's unit protecting Portsmouth Harbor. Now the 3rd New Hampshire Regiment included volunteers from the southwest corner of the province, towns like Jaffrey, New Ipswich, Rindge, and Keene. Under the command of Colonel James Reed, the 3rd arrived about June 10th in Cambridge to bolster the American lines. One private in Captain Richard Thomas's company was 26-year-old Stephen Adams of Jaffrey, who later settled first in Moultonborough and later in Meredith. And if you recognize that name, he became the stepfather of John Bon Swayze here in Meredith. John Wadley of Hampstead, who also later settled in Meredith, and his brother Thomas were privates in Captain Hezekiah Hutchins' company, also in Reed's regiment. And when Reed arrived along the siege lines on the outskirts of Boston, General Ward didn't know where to put them. He told them, try Winter Hill, near Stark's regiment, but that site was already overcrowded. So Reed ended up encamping close to the narrow neck of land connecting Charlestown to the mainland. So that would be this area right in here. So they were encamped in this area up here somewhere. Well, hunkered down on the Boston Peninsula, British General Gage and his 3 junior officers, Generals William Howe, Henry Clinton, and John Burgoyne, recognized 2 points of vulnerability to their position. Located to the north were the hills of Charlestown Peninsula. That's this peninsula right here. Dominated by the highest but most distant hill known as Bunker Hill. And at the south of the peninsula, across from various wharves, were the heights on Dorchester Neck. So Dorchester Heights would be in this area right here. You see the ship here, that would be Rose Wharf, which is where the Boston Tea Party took place. So Gage and his generals agreed that the Dorchester Heights were the most immediate concern and planned to take advantage on Sunday, June 18th, to fortify the position while the Americans were observing their Sabbath services. So here's another map showing the 2 vulnerable points to the north and the south of Boston. again, here's, if you can see there, that's Bunker Hill. This is kind of not in the correct position, which would be Breeds Hill, was more in this area over here. And on the point, there was a third hill called Morton's Hill. And here on the Boston Peninsula, so this is the back bay that was, of course, later filled in, and this is the north end up here. This road that follows across the isthmus here onto there, that's still in existence. It's called Tremont Street. Tremont means three mountains. The three mountains being, I think this is Beacon Hill, which is still there. Up here we have Copp's Hill, which is right across. That's where the Old North Church is, which had the lanterns. And then Fort Hill is down here, which currently there's a road there named after it called Battery March. And the fort was right at the end of it. It's all been leveled pretty much, Fort Hill has. Well, Gage and the generals agreed that the Dorchester Heights were the most immediate concern and planned to take advantage on Sunday, June 18th, as I mentioned. So even though Gage had Boston under martial law, there were enough Patriot sympathizers still in the city to quickly communicate intelligence of the British plans out to the American camp. And if Gage planned to build up Dorchester Heights, well, the Americans figured that they would focus their efforts on Bunker Hill and do it preemptively a day before the Brits began their work south of Boston. So on June 16th, General Ward assigned Colonel William Prescott of Pepperell, Mass., the task of building a redoubt on Bunker Hill, keeping the work as secret as possible. One problem, though, it was less than a week from the summer solstice, meaning that there was maximum daylight and minimum darkness to hide their work. So taking this into account, Prescott didn't begin moving his 12,000-man detachment over the Charlestown Neck until about 6 p.m. that night. It was still light. He had to be very slow and careful about doing it. So instead of stopping at the higher Bunker Hill closest to the neck, Prescott pressed his ranks further to the top of Breeds Hill, located closer to the river and with a better cannon angle to the British fortifications on Copp's Hill across the river. Of course, he thought, well, it's a better camera angle for me. I can shoot my cannons better that way. He forgot that the British could also shoot better at him the other way. So once darkness fell, about 8 or 8:30 p.m., with no daylight saving time back then, the Americans began their work. But what they lacked in time, they made up for in talent. Bunker Hill historian Richard Ketchum notes, these men knew how to use a shovel. Nearly all were farmers, used to the heft of tools. So these hard-working farmers worked through the night and were still at it when dawn started, which was about 4 a.m., again without daylight saving time. So Charlestown at that time was nearly an island. It was attached to the mainland by that narrow stem with the road connecting Charlestown Village to the towns of Cambridge and Medford. The island's most prominent features, especially looking from Boston, were the three hills, Bunker Hill, Breeds Hill, and Morton Hill. And again, we get another view of them here. There's Bunker Hill, Breeds Hill here, and Morton Hill here. This area right in here was a brick kiln, and the waterway was where they got their clay for making the bricks. So in order to charge up this hill, they would have to go around that brick hill in the swamp there. So almost totally surrounding the peninsula are two rivers, the Mystic River to the north, up here, and then the Charles River coming down here with this bay coming in on the western side of Charlestown Peninsula. Now Charlestown Village at the foot of Breeds Hill, so that's right in here, occupied the southwestern corner of the peninsula. By 1775, Charlestown was a sizable village with a population over 2,000 residents. And if any of you have ever walked on the Freedom Trail down in Boston and gone up to Paul Revere's house, and you see how the houses are packed so tightly together. They were that same way here in Charlestown. They were very close, and that actually doomed them a little bit later. So rather than relying on an overland route over the Peninsula Highway to Cambridge, Roxbury, and Boston, it was far more convenient for residents to take advantage of a ferry crossing over to Boston's North End, where now what they used to call the Charlestown Bridge, now it's called the Bill Russell Bridge, those of you are basketball fans. Here's the ferry landing on Charlestown, and right across down in here would be the Boston Peninsula landing. So early June in 1775 was the time of the first hay harvest, and farmers had already begun scything the hay at the top of Bunker Hill, but they hadn't yet finished on the lower levels of the hill. That becomes important a little bit later on. So when the first light of dawn arrived at 3:30 in the morning on June 17th, the British quickly discovered the Americans' work on the peninsula. By 5 a.m., British warships anchored in the Charles River had taken aim and started shelling the easily discovered earthworks that they were building. Initial shelling by the British, however, proved to be ineffective, and General Gage and Howe strategized how they would launch a ground attack. Prescott sent Captain Thomas Knowlton and his 200 Connecticut men to extend the Breeds Hill redoubt east toward the Mystic River along a stone and wood fence. They used the new mowed hay on the hill to stuff wads of hay into the gaps of the fence. Quote, "They made a stout and serviceable barricade," says author Nathaniel Philbrook, "a kind of wood and grass sandwich that became known as the rail fence." Still in the early afternoon, orders arrived urgently summoning Stark's regiment to cross onto Charlestown Neck and to reinforce Prescott's forces. On the way, Stark met up with Colonel James Reed. Remember, he was camped right outside of the peninsula there. And they joined up with Stark, and they all started over onto the peninsula together, with one of the soldiers writing, "Good God, how the cannonballs flew. I freely acknowledge I never had such a tremor come over me before." I think it was more noise than anything, though. Meanwhile, General Howe had been ferrying dozens of boatloads of British regulars across the Charles River to Morton's Point on the northeast corner of the peninsula. Howe had at his disposal an army of 2,400 disciplined fighters moving against the ragtag American force of about 1,500 ununiformed and only minimally trained Americans. While approaching the line, Stark noted that Knowlton's troops hadn't been able to extend the line all the way down to the Mystic River, which left the location still vulnerable to a flanking move by the British. Well, Stark's regiment took up its position down to the Mystic River, with Reed's regiment immediately to his right, and Knowlton stretching from Reed's position up to Prescott's redoubt on Breeds Hill. This defense along the rail fence blocked the British from flanking around the Patriot left. But Stark realized this wouldn't work if the Redcoats landed behind them further up along the riverside. So while most of Stark's companies were stuffing hay in the rail fence, he ordered Delafield Captain John Moore's company to reposition rocks. You know, when the farmers clear fields, they always move the rocks into a pile or a stone wall. He had them reposition those rocks along the embankment of the river to prevent any attempts there of the British landing in their rear. Although hastily prepared, the rail fence looked deceptively strong, serving to deceive the enemy and to give confidence to the Americans. It had been about 6 weeks now since John Kimball, Oliver Smith Jr., Benjamin Neely, Thomas Frohock, and George Bean had left Meredith to follow Stark into Massachusetts. Well, Kimball was in Salem Captain Elisha Woodbury's company, and the other four were in Captain Aaron Kinsman's company from Concord, New Hampshire. Later Meredith residents, John Wadley of Hampstead and Stephen Adams of Jaffrey, had answered the call, and they were waiting up there in James Reed's 3rd New Hampshire Regiment. Now with their makeshift defenses thrown up and their powder horns partially but not adequately filled, they waited for the British advance. Well, the concept of what today we would call war crimes wasn't a real thing back in the American Revolution, and British General John Pigott had no qualms about taking aim at the hundreds of civilians residing in the village of Charlestown on that hot June afternoon. So here you can see the village burning in the background there. As the entire village burned to the ground on the southwestern corner of the Charlestown Peninsula, General Howe began landing his British regulars at Morton's Point on the northeast corner. Howe intended to circle around the Mystic Riverside and hit Prescott's redoubt from the rear. But surprise, he was unaware that they had reinforced the rail fence and the stone wall, and instead of enjoying an easy flanking maneuver, his troops ran into the fierce defenses of Stark's and Reed's New Hampshire men. Howe had to instead send his regiments marching directly up the hill, and here they encountered another obstruction. Although farmers had scythed the hay at the top of the hill, the mowing hadn't yet progressed further down the slope. Howe's army had to proceed through these fields of waist-high hay on ground where Mother Nature had planted an unforeseen impediment. More than one grenadier stumbled into what they thought were potholes. But unlike the seasoned farmers waiting for them up the hill, they didn't know that these potholes had been dug by woodchucks. The woodchuck holes. Yay for the woodchucks. Recollections from the battle that day was that it was exceeding hot. Considering the British advanced up the hills, the advance that began about 3 p.m., it would have been about the hottest part of the day. It resulted in another advantage for the Americans, who, lacking uniforms, were pretty much what they'd been working on the farms, while the British were wearing those bright red, thick wool uniforms. Another American advantage was psychological. They were all volunteers defending their liberty and natural rights. England, on the other hand, still used a system of forced impressment. Their soldiers were not voluntarily serving their country with any sense of national pride. And in addition, it must have been rather daunting for a young British soldier, no matter how disciplined he might have been, to march up in the open and face an armed enemy that was holding the high ground and protected behind battlements. They didn't know that there was just hay in that fence there. So you've all heard the term, don't fire until they see the whites of their eyes. So tradition tells us that someone said that, maybe Colonel Prescott, maybe General Putnam, maybe Colonel Stark. Nobody seems to know whether it was true, and whether or not it was true is still being debated. According to the Stark memoir that was written by Stark's grandson, Caleb, quote, "Not a shot was fired until they came within 80 yards of our line, when a fire opened upon them so rapidly and deadly that in a few moments they broke and fled in confusion." Well, now, 80 yards is pretty much the whole length of a football field. And if you were standing on one end and looking at somebody down at the other end, can you see the whites of their eyes? Not sure that they could. Well, according to Bunker Hill author Nathaniel Philbrick, Stark's command to delay firing referred to a part of the Redcoats' uniform. Quote, "To the east at the rail fence, Colonel Stark told his men to hold their fire until they could see the enemy's half-gaiters." Well, these aren't alligators, but they were referred to leggings on their boots. So as soon as you can see those leggings, then you can fire. Well, Tom mentioned that Phil Polhemus is in the back down there. A couple of his cousins, distant cousins, I bet. Richard and John Polhemus wrote a book, a biography of John Stark. And they suggested that Stark had put a stake in the ground at the point where the advancing British should receive the first American musket volley. Well, whatever the truth might be, from the point of view of the grenadiers marching steadily toward the American line, especially those in the front rank. It must have been nerve-wracking waiting for the Americans to stand up and open fire. And when they did, it was devastating. Now, back in May, Meredith voters had approved purchasing a barrel of gunpowder along with associated lead bullets and flints, and 10 good guns for use by the town's recruits. Towns across the colonies were faced with a problem. Guns were in short supply. Not every farmer had one. In fact, the majority didn't have one. Even more importantly, gunpowder in colonial America was still largely an import, and the previously relied upon supply by England, for some reason, had been cut off. Colonists did their best to stockpile what gunpowder they have, that they could defend it from the British confiscation. For instance, that December 1774 raid on Fort William and Mary in Portsmouth Harbor. Well, whichever, if any, version of the whites of their eyes story is accurate, what is certain is that the colonial forces on June 17, 1775, had only limited gunpowder in their powder horns and too few musket balls in their pouches. Stark and the other commanders had to devise a visual method of some sort to make sure that every shot counted. And make them count they did. Quote, "A fire opened upon them," upon the British, "so rapidly and deadly that in a few moments they broke and fled in confusion," according to the Stark memoir. Well, both Pickett's force at Breed's Hill and Howe's at the rail fence and stone wall were forced to turn back. They stampeded back down the hills, through the tall grass and those woodchuck holes, and stopped only by the Charles River. Howe and Pickett barely succeeded in calming their troops down and reforming their lines. Well, observing safely over in Boston, General Gage dispatched reinforcements to Howe and Pickett, and in less than half an hour, they had their troops once again advancing toward the rebels. And once again, the redcoats dropped under the blistering American fire. Again, from the Stark memoir, we read that the British, quote, "were immediately rallied, reinforced, again led to the attack, and once more gave way before the fatal fire of the New Hampshire marksmen," end quote. Bodies of his vaunted army were dropping all around General Howe, and once again they found themselves regrouping at the base of Breed's and Morton's Hills. Now, John Wadley, who later settled in Meredith, and his brother Thomas were part of Reed's regiment along the rail fence. At the Battle of Bunker Hill, according to the DAR account of the battle, he, Thomas, and his brother John fought side by side, and in the battle, the mainspring of the gun that John carried broke at the first discharge, rendering the weapon useless. But telling Thomas that he would load while the other fired, he did this so quickly that the piece became too hot for holding. But the two brothers, with one gun, were able to load and fire all of their ammunition before they had to leave their position. Well, unwilling, or maybe just too embarrassed, to give in and have a defeat damage his military reputation, Howe conferred with Pickett to coordinate a third advance on the colonists. Instead of advancing toward the entire American line, they determined to avoid Stark and the rail fence and to focus instead solely on Prescott's redoubt at the top of Breed's Hill. Depleted ammunition and gunpowder stockpiles were now a critical problem for Prescott, Stark, and Reed. And bolstered by another 400 reinforcements, Howe had divided his unit, allowing him, along with Pickett's unit, to make a three-point attack against the redoubt. He also changed the troops' formation, and instead of advancing up the hill in a horizontal line, he changed them to go in columns, so there were fewer people in the front to catch that initial wave of firing. Well, desperate to keep their muskets loaded, the Americans discovered one unusual supply. Their artillery had proven useless, but there was powder in those cannonballs. The Americans broke them open and distributed the powder, and those who had them stored the powder in their powder horns. Those who didn't just stuffed it in their pockets. Now, another issue was that very few of the American muskets were equipped with bayonets. So if and when they ran out of gunpowder, they were at a big disadvantage for hand-to-hand combat. So Howe's change of strategy to focus on Prescott's redoubt left Stark's and Reed's regiments along the rail fence out of the final onslaught. But this turned out to be a critical advantage. While Prescott's men were quickly using up the last of their gunpowder and musket balls, the New Hampshire men were able to preserve theirs. With little ammunition and few bayonets for their muskets, Prescott's options were limited as the final wave advanced up Reed's Hill, and it wasn't long before the Redcoats breached the redoubt. Editors of the New Hampshire provincial papers speculate that, quote, had the men under Prescott, Stark, Reed, and Knowlton been armed with bayonets and fully supplied with ammunition, they could and would have held their position against the entire force under General Howe, end quote. But the reality is they didn't have those resources, and now the British were upon them. One significant American casualty during this final defense of the redoubt was the death of Dr. Joseph Warren, depicted here in one of the famous paintings by artist John Trumbull. Although Warren held the rank of Major General, it was pretty much an honorary rank, as he was not a military man, he was a medical man. Although his role in the Massachusetts provincial government exempted him from military service, he voluntarily stepped forward. He actually insisted on it to fight alongside the other patriots. And during the retreat, he took a pistol round in the face and died on the field. But with the attack focused on the redoubt, Prescott's men exhausted their remaining gunpowder quickly. But Stark's line still held their small amount of firepower. And the following account by 19th century historian George Bancroft is included in the New Hampshire state and provincial papers. The little handful of brave men, that's Prescott's men, would have been effectively cut off but for the unfaltering courage of the provincials at the rail fence and on the bank of the Mystic River. They had repulsed the enemy twice and now held them in check until the main body had left the hill. And not till then did the Connecticut companies under Knowlton and the New Hampshire soldiers under Stark quit the station which they had so nobly defended. And as a reminder, a handful of those men came right from Meredith, New Hampshire, right from our town. Well, sometime between 5 and 6 o'clock that afternoon, with the sun still up, the last of the tired colonial troops made it to safety through the gauntlet of British warship guns cannonading Charlestown Neck. Abigail Adams, reporting on the battle in a letter to her husband, John, who was down in Philadelphia at the Continental Congress, she painted a pretty grim picture. Charlestown, she wrote, is laid in ashes. Well, in addition to Joseph Warren, the Americans lost 140 killed and 300 wounded during the Battle of Bunker Hill. But as they made their way back to their encampment at Winter Hill, their mood was more exhilarating than glum. The British had lost over 1,000 killed and wounded, nearly half of their force, including about 100 commissioned officers. And although Howe had technically won the battle because his troops held the field at the end, it was the Americans who won the public relations victory. With only a poorly trained army of poorly equipped farmers, they had proven that they were serious about their quest for liberty and independence. And for the British, it was a public relations nightmare, despite their Pyrrhic victory. General George Clinton, who had watched the battle from the safety of Boston, famously said of the Battle of Bunker Hill, "A few more such victories would have shortly put an end to British dominion in America." So New Hampshire's efforts in defending the rail fence and securing the American withdrawal from Bunker Hill are memorialized with this marker at the Bunker Hill National Historic Park in Charlestown. Meredith soldiers John Kimball, Oliver Smith, Benjamin Neely, Thomas Frohawk, and George Bean from Stark's regiment were among those who settled back into quarters at Winter Hill that afternoon of the Bunker Hill battle, with the future Meredith residents John Wadley and Stephen Adams from James Reed's regiment along with them. They were now allowed to camp on Winter Hill after having been pushed aside earlier. So they were soon reinforced by the relocation of Colonel Enoch Poor's regiment, previously assigned to Portsmouth. Now, down at the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, the Battle of Bunker Hill removed the last scraps of hope for a diplomatic solution to the colony's differences with Mother Britain. In particular, the British Army's burning of Charlestown Village transformed the perception of the conflict from a parent-child disagreement to an all-out war between bitter national enemies. And I say national because the colonists were now starting to think of themselves that way. Although they were still 13 sovereign provinces and states, they were beginning to realize the benefits of joining together as an independent country, as envisioned 20 years earlier at what they called the Albany Congress, which had been called by Benjamin Franklin. It was actually 2 days before Bunker Hill that Congress took its biggest step toward armed resistance against King George. They appointed Virginia delegate George Washington as commander-in-chief on June 15, 1775, and gave him command over a new multi-colony force, now to be known as the Continental Army. Washington left Philadelphia on June 23rd and received word of the Battle of Bunker Hill during his trip north. He arrived in Cambridge, Massachusetts on July 2nd and was immediately discouraged by the condition of the army that he had been chosen to lead. His various officers, including the infamously cantankerous John Stark, were continually bickering and working at cross purposes. And the soldiers lacked proper tenting, clothing, food, and worst of all, proper training. Washington was not just disappointed by New Englanders who had begun this war, writes Nathaniel Philbrick. He was disgusted by them. Recruits wore battle-damaged clothing, and some had abandoned clothing items on the battlefield. Poor nutrition standards and open toileting accommodations contributed to camp diseases with a minimal level of medical supplies and personnel to treat them. A fear that only grew when an epidemic of smallpox swept through the besieged city of Boston. Now, also assigned to report to Cambridge to assist Washington was Brigadier General John Sullivan, previously New Hampshire's delegate to the Continental Congress. Sullivan County in New Hampshire is named after him. Arriving at the American camps shortly after Washington, Sullivan likewise reported on camp conditions to the New Hampshire Provincial Congress, noting it was absolutely necessary to provide the troops with guns, bayonets, blankets, beds, and a chaplain. As Stark's, Reed's, and Poor's New Hampshire regiments settled in on Winter Hill for an extended siege of Boston, General Washington was, as they say, doing the best with what he had to plan strategies. Gage and the British were penned in on the Boston Peninsula, and the American troops surrounded all the approaches to the city, but British still had the Navy to control the harbor and to get supplies to them. Now, Bunker Hill was not the only activity of the revolution that took place in 1775. And I quickly want to go over another battle that was fairly significant, but one we don't hear too much about. And that started with the Quebec expedition. So back in May, 2 colonial militia regiments had joined forces to capture a French and Indian fortress known as Fort Ticonderoga over on Lake Champlain. Colonel Ethan Allen from the disputed territory known as the New Hampshire Grants, later Vermont, and Colonel Benedict Arnold, remember him, from Connecticut, they combined and succeeded in effecting a bloodless victory over the fort from the small, unsuspecting British contingent that was stationed there. One day later, Colonel Seth Warner of the Green Mountain Boys ousted the British from their second Lake Champlain fort at Crown Point. Now, capture of these forts was good news to New Hampshire's frontier towns like Meredith. Memories of the French and Indian Wars that had ended only a little over a decade earlier were still fresh. Although the colonials hoped that native tribes would side with the Americans, the more realistic fear was that they would side with England instead, especially the fierce Iroquois tribes in the western reaches of New York and Pennsylvania. Control of Lake Champlain forts gave the Americans a point of defense against both British and potentially native attacks. So, when Congress, after learning of the Americans' capture of Fort Ticonderoga, proposed removing all the armaments and dismantling the fortress, New Hampshire quickly objected. In a letter to Congress dated June 2, 1775, the provincial legislature, then including Meredith's Representative Ebenezer Smith, they wrote, "Gentlemen," maybe not so much, but a late order of your very respectable Congress for the demolition of the fortress at Ticonderoga and removal of the artillery from thence has very much dampened the expectation of the people in this colony arising from the security of our frontiers, that our frontiers hope to receive by the check the Canadians and savages might receive in any incursions upon us by having a good garrison there. Well, Congress reconsidered, and instead of abandoning the forts, they established a northern department of the new Continental Army, commissioning New York's delegate, Philip Schuyler, as Major General to take command. And on the heels of the Bunker Hill battle, Congress on June 27th directed General Schuyler to advance into Canada, hoping to preemptively enlist the support of both the citizenry and the Native Americans there to the cause of independence. Now, I want you all to promise me to keep this secret from Donald Trump. There was a proposal made to make Canada the 14th colony. This is nothing new under the sun. Schuyler's plan back then was to advance along the St. Lawrence River and to capture Quebec, hopefully before Canadian Governor Guy Carleton could gather a sufficient British force to repel them. Well, over at Washington's Massachusetts headquarters, Colonel Benedict Arnold learned of the planned advance on Quebec and devised a strategy to add a second prong to the attack. He would lead a detachment along the Kennebec River into Maine, crossing into Canada, and then following the Chaudière River north to its confluence with the St. Lawrence opposite Quebec City. Washington liked the plan and quickly approved it. Well, 3 buddies from Captain Aaron Kinsman's company of John Stark's regiment signed up for Arnold's expedition. Thomas Frohawk and Benjamin Neely of Meredith, along with Nehemiah Leavitt of neighboring Gilmanton. All 3 enlisted in a company headed by Captain Henry Dearborn of Nottingham, New Hampshire, who, by the way, President Thomas Jefferson named as his Secretary of War many years later, a couple of decades later. So leaving Fort Western, located in Augusta, Maine, on September 25th, Arnold's expedition quickly began suffering hardships in the Maine and Quebec wilderness. As recounted in the New Hampshire provincial papers, their provisions were exhausted long before reaching the Canadian settlements. Their clothes became so dilapidated as to furnish but little protection against the rigor of a Canadian winter. And many were barefoot for days before they reached Quebec on the 8th of November. The sufferings of this band of heroes cannot be expressed and could have only been endured by a class of men inured to the hardships and exposure. and fired with a patriotism which prompts its possessors to win the victory or to perish in the attempt. John Stark later said it a lot more succinctly, live free or die. Captain Dearborn's company, including the men from Meredith, were among those pushing on through those hardships. The lack of food had the company on the bank of starvation. We marched very early in the morning, reads the October 30th entry of Captain Dearborn's journal. Our provisions were very scant. And a day later he wrote, I saw some of the men on foot tonight, who I find are almost famished for want of provisions. And on November 1st, he added another grisly detail. This day, Captain Goodrich's company killed my dog and another dog and eat them. So those who survived finally arrived at the St. Lawrence River across from Quebec City on November 9th. And between deaths and desertions, there were only about 600 of the original 1,100-man detachment remaining. And if you want to hear more about this and about Benedict Arnold in general, there's going to be a program about Benedict called Benedict Arnold, Patriot and Traitor. I think it's in August, the first Tuesday in August, as part of this speaker series. So I'm looking forward to that anyway. That's going to be a New Hampshire Humanities program. So while Arnold was struggling through the wilderness, General Richard Montgomery was heading the Northern Department Army northeast down the St. Lawrence. So even though if you look at a map it seems to be going up, it's actually downstream as you go north. Due to a combination of logistics and resistance from Canadian Governor Guy Carleton, Montgomery didn't arrive outside the walls of Quebec until December 1, 3 weeks later than Arnold. I don't think Arnold was very happy with that. So I had to go through the wilderness, and you just came down the river. Arnold's detachment was already freezing and starving when they emerged from the main Quebec wilderness in November. From that point, they had to endure the onset of an early and severe northern winter. The weather now is exceeding cold, said Dearborn on December 11th and 12th. Luckily, they found shelter in a hospital until they got run out of the hospital because of an epidemic of smallpox. So, further complicating matters, an outbreak of smallpox was now running through the ranks. And if that wasn't enough, enlistment agreements for the remaining effective soldiers would expire on January 1. Between the cold, the smallpox, and the lingering PTSD of their harrowing trek through Canada, it is easy to understand how some of the men would be very anxious to head home. So, determined to fulfill their mission before that happened, Montgomery and Arnold decided to take advantage of an approaching storm and attack the city on December 31st. They really went up right to the wire. Now, to say the least, the Battle of Quebec was not the Americans' finest hour. It ended with the death of General Montgomery during the attack that he led along the Plains of Abraham outside the city walls. Now, while Montgomery was attacking from the north, Arnold's contingent made its assault on the so-called Old City, perched on the steep St. Lawrence riverbank. Excuse me. During the battle, Arnold took a bullet in the leg and was evacuated early in the battle. Captain Dearborn's company continued to advance, but when they encountered a British counterforce, they discovered their powder had become damp and their muskets wouldn't fire. As a result, Dearborn and his men were among the 400 Americans taken prisoner during the battle. It is unknown whether the 3 Meredith men were captured or whether they were among those earlier hospitalized with smallpox or other maladies. Now, where Lexington and Concord and the Battle of Bunker Hill helped to advance the cause of American liberty and independence, the defeat at Quebec and the eventual retreat back to Fort Ticonderoga the following spring marked the beginning of an extended period of difficulties that greatly dampened the patriotic spirits. The only exception being Washington's bloodless victory that forced the British to evacuate from Boston in March of 1776. So, from our vantage point of 250 years later, it's easy for us to cheer on the freedom fighters because we know what's going to happen. So, they didn't. So, consider the effect, though, of the disaster at Quebec and on the spirit of the colonists who were still unsure if they were doing the right thing, and who realized that if the British were victorious, it would be the end of their pursuit of happiness. It would be the end of their liberty. And in many cases, it would be their lives. You probably all heard the Benjamin Franklin quote, "We all need to hang together, or surely we'll hang separately." It was the beginning of a period that Thomas Paine wrote about several months later. These are the times that try men's souls. And as we begin the observance of the, here we go, semi-quincentennial, the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution this year, we need to once again pay tribute to the men from Meredith who fought in the Battle of Bunker Hill and many of the other battles. A census taken at the beginning of the war showed that Meredith had 60 male residents of fighting age. And of that 60, a total of 42 ended up serving at some point during the Revolutionary War. A remarkable effort that we should all be proud of. Thank you.